The passage for today is 1 Samuel chapters 18, 19, and 20, which Craig will now read for us. It would be safe to say that nobody who met David after he killed Goliath had a neutral reaction to him. David seems to be one of those charismatic people, small c charismatic, please. Don't want to get crazy here. Someone who had that spark, a liveliness, that I'm just going to be myselfness, that people either loved or hated. When you read the account of the life of David, you find he provokes some kind of reaction from the people he encounters, much like Jesus did, in fact. And in these 3 chapters, we see starkly different reactions to David from King Saul and Saul's son, the crown prince Jonathan. In our passage for today, in these 3 chapters, 18, 19, and 20, we're starting to see David in his, what I call his post-Goliath phase. He's a celebrity, which is defined as somebody everybody thinks they know something about. Crowds in the street are singing songs with his name in them. Everybody, literally everybody, has heard of David and some bits of things about him. Hey, he's the guy who killed Goliath. He's a commander of Saul's army. I hear he's a really good lyre player. Of course, later, much later, we'll see the crowds turn against David. His own son, Absalom, will rebel against King David, and David will have to flee Jerusalem. Well, Jesus was treated much the same way. Early on, the crowds loved him. They wanted to take him and make him their king. Later, of course, they're shouting for his crucifixion. Jesus' friends will turn away and abandon him in his hour of deepest need. David will write psalms lamenting the fact that his friends have turned away in his hour of deepest need. The people he thought were his friends and allies have now deserted him and are actually against him. Now, we've already seen how David is a type of Christ, an imperfect metaphor pointing ahead to Jesus, who will follow David in about 1,000 years. This morning, though, I want to focus on the reactions of 2 main characters, Saul and Jonathan, to David, which are pretty clear in this passage. What we'll see is how they mirror the reactions people today, including us, have toward Jesus Christ. Now, King Saul wanted to use David for his own benefit. Once he recognized David's remarkable talents and power, which demonstrated that God was with David. Jonathan simply loved David for his own sake, as a close friend, as a brother, really, and wanted to simply do what he could for David, not to use David for his, Jonathan's, own benefit. Both approaches are ones you find people today taking toward Jesus Christ. The one leads to frustration, anger, and resentment. The other leads to true peace. So this morning, I want us to recognize in Saul and Jonathan how we tend to treat Christ, how we approach him, and what there is in this passage that can help us grow deeper in our walk with Christ. So first, we have to get the overall story. It's kind of a long passage, so we'll need to, we'll need to summarize. So let's start with King Saul. Chapter 18 opens with a quick 5-verse summary of what happened to David after he killed Goliath. I'll read those 5 verses for us. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul, and Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Now, there is a fair bit of Jonathan in that passage, but let's focus on what it says about Saul. Okay, David has killed Goliath. All Israel's heard about it. David is a national hero. So Saul is acting as any normal king does here. Any king would want to secure the services of such a talented and brave warrior, of course. Kings are always looking for valiant soldiers to go out and fight for them. 1 Samuel 14, you might remember, says that whenever Saul saw any strong man, he attached him to himself. Basically, that's Saul's version of the draft. Hey, you're in the army now. Come here. Samuel had warned Israel in chapter 8 that this is what a king would do. The king would take the best of the young men and the young women in the land for himself. Saul's entire focus then is on using others. How can this guy help me further my own goals and priorities? Well, in David's case, it's pretty obvious how David can benefit Saul. Saul wants to use David to fight the battles that Saul himself should be fighting. Remember, the main reason the people told Samuel they wanted a king was to fight the battles for them. And then remember how when the armies of Israel under Saul were confronted with Goliath, who came out and challenged them to send a man to fight against him, it was King Saul's responsibility to be that man. But Saul refused. He was in his tent while Goliath was ranting curses against God and Israel and the army of the Lord. Then David comes along and really saves Saul by killing Goliath himself. Now, it's not that Saul was a bad general. The Bible records that he did go out from time to time to lead the army against the Philistines in battle, and he did have success against them. It's just that Saul wasn't able to completely fulfill the role of king the people wanted, the one Samuel had anointed him for. So here comes David, who is immediately a national hero. Saul, in addition to adding David to his army, also wants some of David's glory to rub off on him. Now, this is an old political trick. Whenever an athlete or adventurer or military hero does something really extraordinary, something that really captures everyone's attention, slide, gets all the headlines, the first thing that happens is politicians rush to get their picture taken beside them. Every year in America, the Super Bowl winner, football team, the World Series baseball winner, or college football championship winning team is given a reception at the White House. So the president can be photographed surrounded by star athletes. Of course, the all-time classic example of this was 1961. This was the height of the Cold War, when Americans were all fearful of the Soviet Union because they had put a satellite, Sputnik, in orbit before America had. But that wasn't the worst of it. In April 1961, a Soviet cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, was put in orbit for about an hour and a half, and then returned safely to Earth. And you really cannot appreciate what a tremendous blow this was to the American psyche. Look, the Russians, those bumbling peasants, are in space. We're not. They can shoot down missiles on us from space. We're doomed. It was, in fact, very much like listening to Goliath shouting at the army of the Lord. Soviets, Russians, loudly bragging about their accomplishment and how they were better and stronger than America. Well, America found our David. Just a month after Gagarin's flight, May 1961, America put an astronaut, Alan Shepard, in orbit and returned him safely to Earth. This was a huge, huge deal. David had won the war against the Soviet Goliath. No, back one. So the first thing that happens is President Kennedy invites Shepard and the other Mercury astronauts for a photo session at the White House. Very big deal. Cameras everywhere. Their wives get to have tea with Jackie. Because, of course, what any politician, any president wants is to be associated with great heroes. Next slide. He wants to use their fame, their courage, their prowess to rub off on him. When people think of the great Alan Shepard, the first American in space, Kennedy wants them thinking of him too. Hey, me and Alan here. Well, that's exactly what's going on with King Saul in chapter 18. Saul wants to use David's remarkable powers, abilities, his star power, his celebrity, to further his own image, his own power, his own kingship. Understandably so. But there's a problem when you take this approach. There's a problem when you try to use the Lord's anointed in service of your own personal goals. We see it in chapter 18, verses 6 through 9, which say, "As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, 'Saul struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s.'" I don't know if that's the exact tune, but it was pretty similar to that, I'm sure. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. Verse 8, he said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul eyed David from that day on. Well, the problem was that since David had the Spirit of the Lord on him, the Spirit which had departed from King Saul suffered by comparison. Now, this little song they were singing in the streets, it meant no disrespect to King Saul. It's a feature of Hebrew lyricism in poetry and song to state a thought in one line and then repeat it in the next line with emphasis added. It's called parallelism. It's all over the Psalms. You see it everywhere. One pretty much random example, Psalm 92:12, which says, "The righteous flourish like a palm tree and grow like a cedar in Lebanon." Or Song of Solomon 8, verse 7, "Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it." You see how the second line amplifies and expands on what the first line says. That's how Hebrew poetry works. So all this song means, all that the women are singing is, yay, we have such heroes in Israel, Saul and David killing thousands and tens of thousands. But the way they were singing it struck Saul with jealousy. Unwarranted jealousy. Because they made it sound like David was off killing tens of thousands, while Saul was only killing thousands. The song never meant to compare the two. But when you're fundamentally insecure, when you're using someone else to prop up your own image of self-worth, not to mention sending him out to do the jobs you know you're supposed to be doing yourself, well, you're going to be hypersensitive to things like that. I mean, you all know how this works. We've all had people take things the wrong way, seeing slights and insults where absolutely none were intended at all. Well, if the other person isn't insecure in themselves, it doesn't happen. Offense is not taken. But King Saul remembers what happened after he failed to kill all the animals, after his victory over the Amalekites. Samuel had told him that God had torn the kingdom away from him and given it to one better than him. My guess is that in his heart of hearts, Saul's coming to realize that the better one, the one to whom God has given the kingdom, the one with the Spirit of the Lord, is none other than David. Back in 1 Samuel 10, Saul, back when he was a new king at Gibeah, was met by a group of prophets with harp, tambourine, flute, and lyre. That must have been a great day for Saul. Now all the music, all the shouting, all the singing is still kind of for him, but kind of for David too. And look, they're saying it's David who's killed 10,000s. It's a misunderstanding, but for Saul, it's almost the last straw. Verse 9 says, "From that day on, David eyed Saul which meant that Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Note what happens when we do that. Verse 10, the next day, and the writer's being very specific about time here, the next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully upon Saul. Or you can say a harmful spirit rushed upon Saul. Drove him mad. Verse 10, he's ranting and raving like a madman around his house. While David's playing music to calm him, Saul picks up a spear and throws it, trying to pin David to the wall. There's imagery for you. He does it twice. Verse 12, we find out that yes, Saul now knows the spirit that was with him, which had been his when he was anointed king of Israel. That spirit's now with David. Saul's afraid. So as a result, Saul puts David in charge of a company of soldiers sent out to fight the Philistines. David's getting too popular, too famous. Better send him out with the army. Get him out of Jerusalem. With any luck, he'll get killed. Well, the plan backfires. Chapter 18, verse 30 says, the more Saul sent David out to fight the Philistines, David had more success against them than any other of Saul's commanders. So Saul wants to really do David in here. So he tries to get him to marry Saul's oldest daughter, Merab. The Bible doesn't say what Merab was like. But the deal is, if David gets to marry the king's daughter, he has to keep fighting the Philistines. Verse 17, Saul's thought is, I'm not going to kill David. But if I keep sending him out to tangle with the Philistines, sooner or later they'll kill him for me. Whether David is wise to this plan or not, he refuses to marry Merab, saying, oh, who I am, I'm not good enough to marry the king's daughter. But then David has a problem. Saul's younger daughter, Michal, loved David. Now, interesting, this is the only time in the entire Old Testament, maybe the only time in the entire Bible, I could be wrong, outside of the Song of Solomon, where it says a woman loved a man. Michal loved David. They come to Saul and say, hey, we want to get married. Saul sees this as another way to get rid of his David problem. He says, hey, that sounds great. Oh, by the way, instead of a bride price, David says, I know you can't afford the price for a king's daughter. Verse 25, just go out and get me 100 Philistine foreskins. He's thinking, again, in verse 25, that in the process of collecting 100 Philistine foreskins, the Philistines might take offense to this, and they would kill David for him. Again, it doesn't work out for Saul. David takes his men, goes out, and gets 200 foreskins. Comes back, gives them to Saul. Probably best not to dwell on that image too long. Says, here you are. Verses 28-29 say, but when Saul saw and knew the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Later on, chapters 19 and 20, we see more attempts by Saul to kill David. Chapter 19, verse 1, Saul even asks Jonathan and his servants to kill David. Jonathan warns David and then tells his father, you can't do this. That would be killing innocent blood without cause. Verse 7, Saul says, okay, you're right, I won't kill David. But by this time, Saul's half mad. His jealousy of David, which invited in evil spirits, leads him to send messengers to David's house to try and capture him and kill him in the morning. His wife saves him, and David flees to Ramah to Samuel. Saul follows him there, and he and David flee to a little town called Naioth. We're in verse 19 here. Saul chases him there, but is overcome by the Spirit of the Lord, and is thrown into ecstatic spiritual experience, again saving David's life. Finally, after talking with Jonathan, David realizes he is never going to be reconciled to Saul. He is never going to be safe around King Saul. King Saul will be his mortal enemy to the end. So David flees and goes to live in the wilderness for the next 10 years. So what do we learn here? friends, when we try to use the Lord's anointed, the Lord himself, Jesus Christ, for our own ends, for our own benefit, it does not work. Saul tried to use David for his own ends. Even when it became apparent that the Spirit of the Lord was on David, David was God's chosen one. David would be the next king. Saul, as much as knows this, Saul tells Jonathan, chapter 20, verse 31, look, I don't know why you insist on being David's friend and helping him. As long as David's alive, you'll never be the king. Saul knows. Saul knows the Lord is working with him through David now. But when Saul realizes it's not going to work, that David is not here to help Saul get his way, Saul turns bitter, jealous, paranoid, and hateful. David was now his enemy. And I wonder if when we're not getting what we want from God, if we don't at some level consider God our enemy. Think about it. Maybe some of you were told, oh, become a Christian, you'll have a better marriage, you'll get a better job, you'll get out of debt, you'll fix things with your kids, get rid of your bad habits, whatever. There's a lot of that kind of preaching out there. The bottom line was that you were led to believe you could use God, his power, for your own benefit. None of us would say that out loud. I have thought that in the past, but I would never have said it out loud. I became a Christian to get the things I want. But maybe somewhere that was in the back of our minds. Maybe we resented God. We resented Jesus when we didn't get what we wanted. Just like King Saul wanted to get things for himself from the Lord's anointed, instead of asking, hey, David, how can I serve you? Hey, David, what would the Lord have me do? You have the Spirit of the Lord on you. Tell me where I fit in. Are the two ways you can approach Jesus Christ, the Lord's anointed? The wrong way is to try to use him for your own ends. King Saul tried that. He ended up mad, jealous, resentful. So what's the alternative? Let's look at Jonathan's way. Chapter 18, first 5 verses we read earlier, we see Jonathan who, as verse 1 says, is knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. In fact, Jonathan makes a covenant with David, gives David Jonathan's own royal robe and armor. Now, one thing that we usually get wrong, I always had wrong, we think of Jonathan and David as being about the same age. Okay, they're not. The usual image we have is that David and Jonathan, practically twins, two blokes, young men, same age. Jonathan would have been significantly older than David. David would have been no more than 20 between killing Goliath and going to flee to the wilderness to escape Saul, after which, incidentally, he never sees Jonathan alive again. Jonathan would have been in his mid to late 30s at the youngest. Now, interestingly, this is the only friendship between two men that's mentioned in the entire Old Testament. I never realized that before. If you think men have a problem making friends now, we always have. But this is not really a model of friendship. What this is, Jonathan, David, it's a model of discipleship. When you read these chapters about David and Jonathan, don't think of how to be a good friend. Think of what it shows about how to be a good disciple. Saul obviously, do you want me to start over, Brooke? Is that? Saul obviously has not yet informed Jonathan that according to Samuel, the kingdom has been ripped away from their family. He's still treating Jonathan as if Jonathan is a king in waiting. As we saw earlier, chapter 20, verse 31, Saul says to Jonathan, as long as David lives, you're not going to establish your kingdom. Well, God's already told him that. But Jonathan knows the reality of the situation. That's why he gives David his royal attire. He's telling David, look, I know that you're going to be king. Chapter 23, verse 17, he comes right out and tells David, look, you shall be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this. As Tim Chester says in his really good book about 1 Samuel, Jonathan is not showing us how to be a good friend. Jonathan is showing us how to be a real follower. Primarily what Jonathan does is he gives up his own rights, quote unquote. I say that in quote, our rights. In reality, we have none. You and I have no rights over God, over and against God. We could be like Saul. We could pretend that we do. We can act as if there are things that are actually our right, things that are cosmically due to us, things we deserve. Saul tries to use David to keep for himself. But no, of course, we don't have any of those rights. We humans don't have a right to anything in the world against God. Jonathan knows this. He knows that all his royal robes and weapons, his royal position itself, belong to God, to whoever the Lord wants to give them to. So it's clear to Jonathan that that someone is David. Instead of trying to use David to hold on to what's not his, like Saul's doing, Jonathan hands him over to David. He's giving away any authority or power he could have. All he wants is to be loyal to the Lord's anointed, David, whatever that costs him. Is that our attitude? Are we content to hand over all we have, all we are, all our rights to the Lord to do with us as he knows best? Do we trust him that much? Don't answer too quickly here. Look what it cost Jonathan to do that. Many of us, I know this is true of myself at least, have trouble handing everything over to God. We try to accommodate. We'll hand over some control, some authority, some of our rights, as long as we get to keep our favorite ones for ourselves. You know, this area of life, this is mine, God. I'll give you everything else, but this is mine. Jonathan tries this for a while. Chapter 19, first 7 verses, Jonathan tries to mediate. He's trying to reconcile Saul and David. Verse 1, and Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, Saul, my father, seeks to kill you. Therefore, be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself, and I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak to my father about you. And if I learn anything, I will tell you. And Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, let not the king sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought good to you, for he took his life in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine. And the Lord worked a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan. Saul swore, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. And Jonathan called David, and Jonathan reported to him all these things. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as before. So it would appear that Jonathan succeeded. He won a temporary truce. What happens 2 verses later? Saul is trying to pin David to the wall with a spear. He sends his men to stake out David's house, chapter 19, verses 11 to 17, as we saw earlier, to catch David and kill him when he gets up in the morning. Now, I have no doubt, had it not been Saul's own daughter, who was David's wife, Saul would have sent his men straight into David's house to take him by force. But if he had done that, his daughter might have gotten hurt in the action. So Saul tells them to wait for the morning, wait for when David leaves the house. Well, temporary truces with sin never hold. Sin always comes roaring back. Jonathan realizes this after a while. He realizes he has to choose either his father, his family, his future, or his loyalty to David as the anointed of the Lord. Chapter 20, verse 32. Saul accuses Jonathan of siding with David, and he's correct. When Jonathan asks Saul, what harm has David done? Saul, tries to pin Jonathan to the wall with a spear. You don't want to get on this guy's bad side. Even Jonathan knows it's over now. David must flee, or else Saul will kill him sooner or later. So Jonathan sends David away. They never see each other again. Did Jonathan know that was the last time he would ever see his beloved friend? I think so. I think he strongly suspected it. But he knew it was the right thing to do. Friends, when it comes to the Lord's anointed, you have a choice. You can try to use him for your own benefit, to advance your own interests, like Saul did. That will fail. It will leave you bitter and angry. In your heart, you'll be an enemy of the Lord. That may have happened to some of us here today. Or we can do as Jonathan did. Recognize him as Lord of all, the true king, and give up whatever, quote-unquote, rights or priorities we have in order to serve him however you can. Saul's way drove him mad, whereas Jonathan is one of the most admirable characters in the entire Old Testament, entire Bible, I think. I don't think he gets enough credit today. David is the anointed of the Lord, the one who points the way forward in history to Jesus Christ. Just like Saul and Jonathan, when it comes to Christ, we have to choose. We cannot reconcile Christ with our sin. Jonathan tried that. He tried to have both Saul and David. To his credit, he realized this doesn't work. In choosing the one, we give the other up completely. In conclusion, this means making very difficult choices. I know that. It may mean losing relationships with some family. Jesus knew this. Matthew chapter 10, he said, if you value your relationships with your parents, your children, more than me, you aren't worthy of me. Now, that's a very difficult thing to hear. You don't hear a lot of sermons on that. It's even more difficult to do. But Jonathan did it. He gave up not only his father, but his chance at the kingdom. Did he give it up for love of David, for true friendship, as you hear many say? No, at least not totally. No, Jonathan knew that David was more than just the best friend. David was the anointed of the Lord. David was a natural master, the chosen leader. And Jonathan knew the best thing he could do is be his servant. This allows Jonathan to do the difficult thing and to give up everything, all his own goals, for the sake of the Lord. Well, that's something Saul could never do. It's not told to us. Jonathan kind of drops out of the story at this point, but I'm sure he found peace in that. However difficult things were with his father. Are we having difficulty doing that this morning? I understand. We're humans. Of course it's going to be difficult. If it's not, I would worry about you. Our natural tendency is to want to use God, his power, for our own selfish goals. But with the help of the Holy Spirit, we can turn that around. We can use God's power to give up our selfish goals, accept the forgiveness from sin that Christ offers, and then live the life we were created to live. Only that brings true peace. Let us pray. Thank you for the story, Father, David and Jonathan. I pray that as we continue to read it and to reread it thoughtfully, Holy Spirit, you will open our minds and our hearts to what it is we can learn that will help us in our daily lives today. Trust you more. Give up that which is not pleasing to you. In your name we pray. Amen.